My father, Andrei Sergeyevich, was engaged in peasant labor before the outbreak of the First World War. In 1912, he was called up for active service. He went through the entire imperialist war on the fronts. He served faithfully, received 2 George Crosses and the rank of non-commissioned officer. He returned to his native land, to Talitsa, in 1919 and was drafted into the OGPU and appointed commissioner for the district. He held this position until 1929. The service turned out to be hectic and dangerous. I remember that my grandfather often scolded my father, "Everyone has sons like sons, living at home, engaged in peasantry, and you are travelling around the county catching some contralooseners." My mother, Lukia Yevgenievna, agreed with my father-in-law. "My father-in-law is right, but quit the service, or these contralooseners will tear your head off." My father, listening to these conversations, chuckled, silently pulled on his boots, put on his overcoat, checked whether the Nagant was loaded, and left the house. It happened that he returned from his trips only after a few days. I was proud of my father and often reminded my comrades that he had a Nagant and was fighting the bourgeois. For the rest of my life, I remembered the year 1929. A commune was organized in Talitsa. My father was elected chairman. Barracks with long-through corridors and small rooms were built 2 kilometers from the village. The village emptied out. The whole of Talitsa fit into 3 barracks. There was a common canteen, and the food was free. I and many of my buddies managed to eat lunch, and sometimes dinner twice. Boys and girls my age built an ice slide. It was crowded and noisy. We kids liked the new life. Promenades from Talitsa brought cattle, geese and chickens in baskets. The cattle and poultry were housed in huge coal sheds made hastily from poles and brushwood. My father was at work all day long, and we rarely saw him. He came home frowning, speechless, always in a hurry. He was shriveled up, overgrown. In our place, it was the first experience of creating a commune. People wanted a better life, but they didn't know how to build it. They went forward by feel, and of course made many mistakes. The commune existed for a year and disintegrated. Everyone returned to the village, and in the village the houses were destroyed without doors and windows. In spring, as soon as the roads were dry, my father said that we had to move from the village to the city. My mother burst into tears. How could I leave the place I had been forced to leave? Where to go? She was very sad about her farm, and we had a straw-roofed house, 5 chickens and a skinny piglet. But my father was determined to go, and he explained his decision. The industrialization of the country was underway. New factories, power plants, mines were being built. The Soviet state is on a wide industrial road. The city needs labor force. My father was attracted to the new boiling life. Windows and doors were boarded up. Uncle Vasya, my father's brother, harnessed his grey horse, loaded our belongings on a cart and set off. We reached the Berezovsky plant on the 5th day, found Marina, my older sister. But we did not have to live with her. My sister herself rented a small room. We were taken in by a neighbor, a prospector, strict in appearance. At first he looked at the children in silence. I, the eldest, was 8 years old. My sisters Katya was 6 and Paraskovia 4. The youngest brother, Volodya, was not yet walking, sitting in his mother's arms, clinging tightly to her neck with both hands. He saw the bearded man and cried loudly. "Well, don't cry. We'll live amicably," said the prospector, and went into the house. We lived with Medvedev for 8 years, and I must say that he turned out to be a kind and gentle man. Our maluka, as they called the outhouse in which we lived, consisted of 1 room. It was spacious but cold. It was heated by an iron stove. Food was cooked on the stove. It's hard for me to believe it now. In those distant years of my childhood, my mother cooked for us only chowder and potatoes in uniform. We didn't know any other food. The first time in my life I ate rice porridge with sunflower oil was when I became an apprentice turner. How delicious that rice seemed. My childhood, like the childhood of many of my peers, was hard. The family was large. My father earned little. My mother was a dressmaker, sewing shirts and pants for the family. Sometimes she borrowed sewing from people. This gave additional money to my father's salary, but it was not enough. In the summer of 1932, after graduating from the second grade, 10-year-old boy, I spent all my vacations tending cows. I thought I would earn money for leather boots and a cloth coat with a real fur collar by school. Igor Ivanovich Isakov, a senior shepherd, was a kind man, but sick and with a leaky memory, as people said about him. He suffered from sciatica. He would lie down in the shade under the trees, put his hands on his lower back and sigh until he fell asleep. He would tell us, the sub-passengers, where to drive the herd, where to feed and when to give the cattle a rest. We, satisfied with his trust, tried our best. I came home tired but proud I was working, and soon I would have leather boots and a coat with a real collar. All summer I worked cows. I got tanned, my face turned black from the sun and wind, but I achieved what I wanted. I earned money for boots and a coat. My mother rejoiced as much as I did and said with tears in her eyes, "Well, thank God, now Stepanko is working. Life will be easier." I went to school in Talitsa and finished 7 grades in Berezovsky. In this town, or rather in Leninsky settlement, in 1938 we received an apartment. It was in a 2-story barrack, but how happy we were with it. My mother began to stoke the oven and kept saying at least the oven would bake well and the room would be warm, otherwise we had profited from the cold. The oven baked well. On the table appeared ruddy, puffy potato dumplings. My mother's eyes shone, thank God. Finally we have lived a good life and won't want to die. Then she praised me. Stepanko has become a turner, he earns well. In the evenings my father would sit at the table, put on his glasses and read the newspapers aloud. I remember that, first of all, he was interested in reports about new factories, mines, power stations. He persuaded my mother to go to the new construction sites. "No, father, I'm not going to leave from such a fatera. I won't go anywhere in my life." I memorized such words as Euromash, Magnitka, Rosselmash, Dnepriges from my adolescence. Then my father read about what was being done abroad in our country. Many times he repeated, "The imperialists are grinding their teeth on us, grinding. It smells like gunpowder. It smells like gunpowder." In the evenings, adults and we young men and teenagers would gather on benches near our barracks and talk about Germany and the fascists. Having finished 7 grades of incomplete secondary school, I worked in the workshop at the garage. I liked the turner's craft, but I knew that it was not the most important thing in my life. The main thing ahead to enter a military school, to be a commander of the Red Army. At night I dreamed of military uniforms. My youth coincided with the time when Soviet pilots set one record after another and the whole world was talking about them. Chakalov, Baidukov and Belyakov made an unprecedented flight across the North Pole. Kokinaki broke all records in reaching altitude, and understandably I and my peers dreamed only of aviation. Having secured the recommendation of the District Komsomol Committee, I applied to the Military Aviation School. But here I was a failure. The commission refused me because of my age. Almost a year was not enough. In the garage where I worked, teenagers took a course of primary military training. They studied the basics of tactics, the material part of small arms, rifles and machine guns, various statutes and manuals. Now I, as well as my comrades, was engaged in the circle of a Sovyakim and passed standards for badges Voroshilovsky shooter, GTO ready for labour and defence, GSO ready for sanitary defence. It was not just a sport, we possessed a universal desire to be ready for the defence of the motherland. In 1938, a great event happened in my life. I was accepted into the ranks of Lenin's Komsomol, and I proudly wore the badge of a Komsomol member. In April 1941, I was summoned to the military enlistment office. Nestroyev, now your age is suitable. But we will offer you not aviation, but infantry school, said the military commander. Think, decide. Infantry school prepares infantry commanders, platoon commanders, lieutenants. I didn't think for a long time. Whether on the ground, in the air it doesn't matter, as long as to be a commander of the Red Army. And I answered, I agree, I'll go to the infantry. The school to which I was sent was old and well known. It was located in Sverdlovsk and was called Cherkassky Military Infantry. The thing is that before the war it was transferred to the Urals from Ukraine. On Sunday, June 22, 1941, our 2nd Cadet Company was raised at the usual time, provided by the strict army routine: physical exercise, then breakfast. Everything went on as usual. It was a clear, sunny day. On the Platz that morning there was a sports competition for the championship of the company. In the midst of competitions, to the front entrance of the main building drove up Gazik. Out of the car came out the head of the school, Colonel Tutrin, and quickly headed into the room. His face was concerned, even stern. Someone said now the colonel will raise the school on alarm and arrange a throw in gas masks for the Gorilalov cordon. Such throws were held quite often. The Finnish war showed that in modern warfare the success of the battle depends largely on the individual training of the fighter and, of course, physical. As for spiritual, we had it at the highest level. We were clearly aware of what we were preparing for. A walk behind the Gorilov cordon, and even in gas masks, was not pleasant. Would we really have to make a throw in such heat? Not 5 minutes later, as from the main building to the training ground came the head of the school, the commissar, the commanders of all 4 cadet battalions with the commissars and chiefs of staff, built all the personnel. Platz froze. The colonel was silent. The silence was dead. Finally, slowly, but in a loud, strong voice, the head of the school said, "Comrades cadets, comrades commanders and political workers, Nazi Germany has violated the non-aggression agreement and invaded the Soviet state. The war has begun." With the beginning of the war, life in the school changed abruptly. We were now studying 12 hours a day. Our food ration was reduced. Everything became more and more anxious on the soul, especially after the message of the Inform Bureau that the Germans were bombing Moscow. Echelons of evacuees began to arrive in Sverdlovsk. They came day and night. All the train stations were packed with old men, women and children. It was scary to look at them. Many were in light clothes, and meanwhile frost had already struck. My relatives often came from Berezovsk to visit me at the school. Every time my mother sighed heavily and said, "You will go to the front, and the Germans will tear your head off there if you don't obey your sergeant. Obey him, he is your superior." The commander of our squad was the same cadet, but older than me by years, and had some life experience. He was promoted to the rank of junior sergeant by the school command, and he was our closest superior. My relationship with my squad commander, Junior Sergeant Skorokodov, was not going well. I had a good knowledge of topography and ballistics, and we often had arguments during self-training. Knowing my rightness in this, or that rule, I tried not to back down. Skorokodov was a stubborn man, and, even if he was obviously wrong, ended the conversation like this: "Who are you arguing with?" Respect the commander. Cadets of the department, listening to our argument and supporting me, did not hide their smiles and joked at the detached. Skorokodov decided to pacify me, as he put it, through my mother. He told her that I did not obey my commander, that is, him. She reminded me at every meeting to be nice to the commander. I calmed her down, assuring her that the German would not tear off everyone's head, and that I was behaving with the junior sergeant as I was supposed to do according to the regulations. The last meeting with my parents took place on December 10th. We agreed that they would come in a week, that is, December 17th. The school was talking about early graduation of cadets, and we were preparing to go to the front. We were waiting for graduation by the new year of 1942. On December 15th, the school was raised on alarm at 4 o'clock in the morning. The cadets were lined up in the 40-degree frost. Soon came the entire command headed by the head of the school. He read out the order of the commander of the Ural military district on graduation by the light of lanterns. Out of all the cadets, 100 received the rank of lieutenant, including me. The rest were given the rank of sergeant or senior sergeant. All graduates were sent to the active army. I, as part of a team of 32 men, was assigned to a city in the Chelyabinsk region, where the 53rd Ural Reserve Army was being formed. Our team was ordered on the morning train that same day to go to the unit. I never had to say goodbye to my relatives before departure. We found the unit with difficulty. The Chief of Staff of the 423rd Rifle Regiment, Captain Reassignments, met us dryly. Having checked our directions and looked at our uniforms, he said unhappily, "You couldn't even outfit us." We really didn't look like lieutenants. All were in worn-out overcoats with cadet buttonholes. By evening we were dressed in the commander's uniform. For the first time I pinned cubes to the buttonholes, put on the commander's belt with a shoulder harness. Arrived young commanders were distributed among battalions. I was appointed commander of the regiment's infantry reconnaissance platoon. We did not have to live in the camp for long. The front needed reserves. Our 166th Infantry Division was sent to the front line. I imagined that the front is a wall of enemy troops, and you, confident in your strength and the bravery of your subordinates, lead them into hand-to-hand combat, which ultimately decides the success of the battle. The enemy flees, you pursue him. But the front was different. The bursting of enemy shells and mines, the howl of diving planes, the rumble of bombs, and more moaning, and the screams of the wounded, and no enemy columns. But before the bursting of shells and mines there was still a march, long and tiring. From the camp we travelled in an echelon by railroad to the station Cherny Dor in the Kalinin region. We arrived at the northwestern front. From the station Cherny Dor we made the transition on foot and walked more than 100 kilometers. We concentrated in the forest behind Lake Seliga. On the same day we were thrown into battle. We knew that the enemy was ahead and we had to get closer to him and knock him out of the trenches, take some unnamed heights. I remember one thing from this battle. I was running forward almost in a continuous smoke of bursts. There was a sharp smell of gunpowder. People were falling on my right and left. I was stopped by a wire fence and dense machine gun fire. I fell into a hole under the barbed wire. I took a breath, looked around. It was already evening. Not a soul around. The fascists were continuously illuminating the field with rockets. Fire clods, not having time to burn in the air, with hissing fell and burned down near me. Then I cautiously got out of the hole and crawled to a small hill, which was about 200 meters from the wire fence. Behind it, I could hear Russian speech. I stood up to my full height, and with a slow step, with my head down, headed towards my own. The feeling was that all the blame for the failure of the offensive lay on me. Before dawn, Captain Ryazantsev gathered single and scattered groups of soldiers, took us about 500 meters to the rear and ordered us to dig trenches. In that first battle I did not understand much, but I learned perfectly well what the front is. The front is not only the bursting of mines and shells, the front is not only a battle, but also a lot of hard-work trenches. The Chief of Staff of the regiment turned out to be not a dry man, as he seemed to me at the first meeting. He was attentive, brave, decisive commander. Ryazantsev, together with the Commissar of the regiment battalion, Commissar Fedin, managed to quickly bring the half-defeated regiment into a fighting condition. Battalions occupied defence areas, dug trenches, passages of communication. With each company established a telephone link. Captain Ryazantsev spent days and nights on the front line. He often told me, "Before you become a good scout, you must know perfectly the defence of your regiment, to study the defence of the enemy ahead of you, to have patience, to be able to bear everything." I was glad and even proud that Ryazantsev, going from the regimental headquarters to the front line, always took me with him. From him I learned how to properly organise the fire system in the defence. He made me a soldier, a front-line soldier, a scout. All my life I will owe Captain Ryazantsev for helping me to become a commander. The regiment stood in defence since May 1942. During this time I, with my scouts, organised a whole series of observation points on the front line in the strip of our regiment. All observation points had a telephone connection directly with the regiment headquarters. Every movement of the enemy or enemy firing point was recorded on the scheme, from the scheme on the map. The enemy's defence was on the heights. All of them were riddled with trenches, passages of communication. In front of the trenches wire fence in 4 or 5 stakes. On the heights were seen dozens of pillboxes, bunkers and armoured hoods. To all appearances, the Germans had settled here in defence for a long time and thoroughly. Our front line was along the ravine in front of the heights, only somewhere there were small hills. The spring and summer of 1942 were rainy. In the trenches there was water up to the waist. Soldiers scooped water out of the trenches with helmets and kettles. There was also water in the dugouts. Our clothes did not dry out. We walked wet. We didn't change our shoes for weeks. When sometimes the sun would come out and the rain would stop, and it happened rarely, all of us were steaming, our clothes were drying right on us. It was impossible to get out of the trench, to warm up and dry ourselves in the sun. The enemy's defence was 1/2 kilometre away, in some places 1 kilometre away from us. Our trenches were visible. The terrain was open. As soon as someone leaned out of the trench, the fascists opened fire. On June 27th, Captain Reassignments gave the reconnaissance platoon a combat task in the area of the village of Belpavaya to capture a prisoner, or, as the military say, language to take. There was no time for preparation. Language tomorrow must be delivered to the regiment commander. The order for reconnaissance was given to me by the Chief of Staff, but it was the order of Lieutenant Colonel Kopylov. The regiment commander I knew poorly. I very rarely had to meet with him in the service. I was not involved in the life of scouts, their affairs. At the same time, I thought the regiment commander is a big boss. He is busy with more important things. He does not care about us. But I didn't know what exactly he was busy with. But I understood if the lieutenant colonel ordered it, die, but do it. In front of the village Belpavaya, or rather, the place where there was a village, defended the 1st Battalion under the command of Captain Ivan Vasilievich Demidov, a native of Altai. A natural Siberian, an excellent hunter, and a warm-hearted man. He, a cadre commander, fought at Kasan, participated in the battles of the Finnish campaign, was wounded near Vyborg, and was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. In the Patriotic War he participated from the first day and had combat experience. Demidov in the regimental headquarters learned that tonight, through the fighting order of his battalion, will go in search of scouts. Combat assured me that the actions of the reconnaissance will support the fire of his companies of the first echelon, and if necessary, will lead the reserve platoon in the attack. Captain Demidov's assurances gave me confidence in success. The search party included 15 men, including 3 sappers. They were excellent warriors, people of different nationalities, ages and characters. They were united by one desire to fulfill the task with honor. Particular physical strength and courage possessed Tatar Vladimir Yusupov, Belarusian Mikhail Kubarsky, Russian Grigory Alexeyev, Ukrainian Ivan Ivashenko. Evening came quickly. We knew the enemy's defense well, especially in the search area. With the onset of darkness, 3 sappers, accompanied by 2 scouts, crawled along the neutral strip towards the enemy. We, the main reconnaissance group, moved about 30 meters behind them. I was very worried. It seemed that the whole country was watching our actions, and the course of almost all the combat events at the front depended on the fulfillment of the task. The sappers silently made passages in the wire and minefield. We advanced even further and were between enemy bunkers. The fascists were firing machine gun fire without aim. Tracer bullets streamed low, above the ground. At times rockets flashed in the dark sky. We descended into the German trench. According to the plan, outlined in the afternoon at the starting line, I left in the trench 4 scouts. They were to defend the passage to ensure our rear. I with the others went to the left. Before the bazooka we stopped and took the door on the site. Now it was necessary to cover the group, and from the other flank, forward to the nearest bend of the trench, went 4 more scouts. The bunker was securely blocked. I opened the door with a jerk. Kubarsky commanded Hendy Hock. There were only 3 Nazis in the dugout. They were so stunned that they could not even raise their hands. But in the next moment they came to their senses and grabbed their weapons. In the fight 2 Germans were killed. 1 Yusupov and Ivashenko tied up and gagged him. Immediately we left the bunker. The capture group, followed by all the other scouts, crawled back to the location of their troops. It was joyful on the soul, language was taken, and no losses. But the summer night is short. It was getting light. We had no time to crawl 100 meters as the enemy defense came to life. A downpour of machine gun fire fell on us. I gave Yusupov and Ivashenko the order to bring the prisoner as soon as possible to the regimental headquarters. I took a position with the remaining scouts and opened fire. A fascist chain appeared. Hitlerites raised machine guns and immediately went into attack. From our side, artillery hit the enemy. We were also firing, but it was quickly weakening. Many scouts in this unequal fight were killed. Finally, Hitlerites lay down. Considering that enough time had passed and Yusupov and Ivashenko had already delivered the prisoner to their trench, I signalled a withdrawal. Meanwhile, the fascists opened artillery fire. Pillars of smoke rose on our way. 400 meters left to the trench. 400 meters is a small road, but under fire it was very long. When I jumped into my trench, it turned out that out of 15 men only 3 of us had returned. To make matters worse, a prisoner was badly wounded. Captain Demyansk allocated from his battalion medics and ordered to help us as soon as possible to bring the tongue to the command post. And here we are in the dugout of the regiment commander. Around the German Lieutenant Colonel Kopilov, Commissar Fedin, Captain Reassignments, me, the interpreter, and the regimental doctor. The interpreter asked the prisoner a question. The wounded man was silent, breathed often, and despite the help given to him by the doctor, soon died. I had seen stern men, I had seen men in anger, but I had never met any man in such a rage as Kopilov was in. He came up to me. "Who have you brought? We need a living tongue, not a dead one. Get out of here." I ran out of the dugout. I couldn't go to the platoon, I was ashamed. Without noticing the swamps, I went towards the front line. The forest was thick, I lost the path, fell into some deep hole from which I could hardly get out, and only before dawn I found one of my observation points. I reported by phone to the Chief of Staff that I was on the front line, and only then I calmed down a little. The next day I was summoned to the regimental headquarters. I was walking with anxious thoughts. I did not take offence at the regimental commander, but thought to the pain in my temples what was my mistake, what was my fault. Commissar Fedin met me in a fatherly way. He was 20 years older than me, and I was old enough to be his son. In his dugout we first had dinner, smoked, he showed me pictures of his children and wife, asked me what I had worked before the war, where I lived, whether I often received letters from my relatives. Fedin even told some funny anecdotes. We laughed, and I went away with my thoughts to the pre-war world, as if there was no war in the world. Then came Captain Reassignments, and we talked about business. Before my platoon was assigned the task on the night of August 1st, with a squad of sappers attached to me and 2 squads of automatic riflemen, a total of 78 people, to make a reconnaissance by combat, seize the height of 76.8, take a prisoner, entrench and hold on, until a special signal. This height dominated our area. In addition, it deeply cut into the defence of the 1st Battalion of Captain Demyansk. It was nicknamed Tooth. To tear out the tooth that was our task. We had a whole day to prepare for the battle. Well, it's good to have time to think everything over. In the morning, I took the squad leaders to the front line, to the Tooth. First, we gathered in the dugout of the battalion commander. The dugout was spacious, located near the road going from Molvatitsa to Demyansk. I was there 29 years later, in February 1971. Without difficulty I found the height. There was a big hole on the height here, was our dugout, from which I left for reconnaissance on August 1st, 1942. My wife, Lydia Filipovna, employees of the Demyansk District Committee of the party and the District Committee of Komsomol with interest inspected the area where 29 years ago, 2 years in a row, there were fights of local importance. From the dugout we went into the trench, and on the spot outlined the plan of attack. I had no doubt that we would take the height. Our attack for the Nazis was unexpected. It was supported by artillery and was a complete success. Losses were small: 2 killed, 7 wounded. We captured 4 Nazis headed by an Oberleutnant and sent them to the regimental headquarters. The telephone connection was extended to us. Ryazantsev ordered to immediately entrench on the opposite slopes of the height from our defence, and to hold on, by all means to hold on. Work began to boil. Not a single shot was heard from the side of the fascists. There was silence all around, which made it even creepy. Dawn was coming quickly. From the height of the enemy's turnover was viewed far away. His second trench stretched out in front of us below, about 800 meters away. Everyone's mood was elevated. The soldiers were joking. The day was sunny, not a single cloud in the sky. And then the silence was broken by the rumble of airplanes. They were coming from the enemy side. The planes were high up. At first we didn't pay any attention to them. The planes flew over the front line. But soon they turned around and from a great height went into a dive on the tooth. The roar of the engines drowned out all voices. Immediately the first bombs fell on us. The earth was covered with smoke. It shook like a fever. It seemed that we were not on high, but on some small sliver and floating on the waves. The trenches crumbled. And the raid went on and on. Barely one group of storm troopers bombed, as it is replaced by a new squadron of Junkers. And so for 2 hours. They seemed to us longer than 24 hours. We, survivors of the bombing, had no time to shake off the ground, as 10 tanks moved to the height. They were followed by infantry. In the midst of the battle, communication with the regiment broke down. But the tanks did not reach the height. They were stopped by our artillery. Fire was strong, and most importantly accurate. Almost simultaneously 3 tanks went up in flames. The rest turned back. The fascist infantry first lay low. Its ranks were upset. But soon Hitlerites began to accumulate in the gully and prepare for an attack. By that time we had already suffered heavy losses. But the survivors were ready for further fighting. And when the Nazis went on the attack, we met them with a dense fire. The Germans rolled back, leaving dozens of corpses. The respite was short-lived. In the air again appeared airplanes. On the height again moved tanks and infantry. During the day they attacked us 3 times and, suffering losses, retreated. The whole height was blackened with craters from bombs and shells. Neither trenches nor trenches were left on it. Everything was destroyed. Night came. It passed quietly. We sent the wounded to the rear. Before dawn, Captain Kondratyev came to the height. He was the regiment's chief of intelligence, PNSH-2. He reported. The regiment commander ordered to withdraw to the line of his defence. Before the war, one saw a lot of movies and remembered for life the rule: the commander is the last to leave the ship or position. I decided to do the same. I sent everyone to the rear. I myself, with Volodya Yusupov, stayed at the height with a hand machine gun to cover the withdrawal. The fascists did not hesitate to open artillery fire. How my soldiers withdrew, I learned only a few months later. And then Yusupov and I were in a dilapidated trench. Shells rarely burst at altitude. The fascist infantry didn't dare to attack. Staying at the height became senseless. We went down and moved to our trench. When it was 3 or 4 meters away, a shell exploded between me and Yusupov. We were running almost side by side. The blast wave threw me to one side and Yusupov to the other. I fell on my back. My breath caught. Something warm and sticky appeared on my lips. I lost consciousness. Already in the infirmary, I learned that Volodya Yusupov had been killed. Out of 78 people, there were 24 alive. I regained consciousness in the infirmary on the 5th day. My torso was tightly tied with bandages. I knew that I was badly wounded and experiencing excruciating pain. I thought about the main thing: to survive. And I wanted to live. I really wanted to live. I was only 19 years old. For a whole month, I was lying in the infirmary as non-transportable. Then my health improved and I was evacuated to the rear. We were taken further and further away from the front by automobiles, in a railroad train under frequent bombing. I got to Kostroma. In the hospital, I was lying in a bright room on a bunk with 2 snow-white sheets. Paradise. But 2 months passed, and the paradise became unbearable. The reports from the fronts were alarming. The Germans had taken Rostov and were rushing to the Volga. At every round, the wounded asked the doctor to discharge them from the hospital faster. I also asked. One day the doctor told me, don't hurry with discharge. After a heavy wound, the commission will give you leave. You will go home. It was unexpected. I must admit that I really wanted to visit Berezovsky. My father, mother, sisters and brother would certainly be happy. At the same time, I was thinking about the front. So I lived the last days in the hospital. Mentally, I was in my native Berezovsky, then in my regiment. And then came the morning, when I had to appear before the commission. In the corridors, in the lobby, and in all the vestibules, crowded people. 80 people were called to the commission. The nurse who was setting up the line came out of the door. Everyone hushed. Nestroyev, to the commission. ... Several doctors were checking my health, and they were talking about something among themselves in a low voice. I thought obviously they are consulting on how many months to give me a leave of absence. The examination was over. The chairman of the commission, an elderly military doctor, took off his glasses and cheerfully said, "Well recovered. You're fit for service. Do you want to go to the front?" I replied, "Sure." I couldn't say I wanted to go home. That was the end of my long-awaited commission. The same day I received my papers and left for the Northwestern Front. The road was long and difficult, and I remembered the hospital many times. I thought a lot about home. Now I felt sad that I had not been to Berezovsky. How are my mother, father, sisters and brother? On the road, one wound, which had healed a week ago, began to ooze, and I had to put a bandage on it. I found the personnel department of the front not far from the station Guzyatino, Kalinin region, in a thick, swampy forest. It was drizzling fine autumn rain. The overcoat issued in the hospital turned out to be too big. It got wet and heavy. From fatigue and weakness, I could hardly stand on my feet. I went into the dugout of the personnel department. I was smelled by the smell of red-hot iron stove and the odour of the fag smoke. Well, that's the end of 8 days of wandering from Kostroma to Guzyatino. Now I'll dry off, have a rest in warmth, and then it will be possible to go further. I joined the queue. Near the table where the major sat, crowded up to 24 commanders who came, like me, for the direction. The line went quickly. The major gave each a small piece of paper and said something briefly. I approached him and reported. Senior Lieutenant Nestroyev, after hospitalization, arrived in the active army for further service to expel Hitler's hordes from our land. Someone at the door jumped into a fist. Indeed, my report sounded a little high-minded. I was embarrassed. The major looked at me for a minute and nodded his head approvingly, then handed me a direction and said that you need to go immediately. The personnel department of your army is located near the village of Molvotitsa. Can you find it? Yes, I can find it. So much for drying your coat, resting in the warmth. I came out of the dugout. It was still pouring rain, only larger and sharper. I went to the railroad without looking at the mud and puddles. I got to the railroad bed and walked along the sleepers to the Bologoy station, which was 5 kilometers from Guzyatino. At the station I saw a terrible picture of destruction. In place of the station there were piles of bricks and pieces of rusty roofing iron. Where was the platform? Big craters from high explosive bombs. Rails, together with sleepers torn off the canvas, were standing on the ground. Not far from the station several freight cars were lying under the slope. "Hey, servant," a man's voice called me. "Do you have any tobacco?" I approached an elderly man dressed in a teleogrika, stained with fuel oil, and realized that it was a worker of the station. I said hello. I took out a pouch of wet tobacco and handed it to him. They smoked. "Where are you going?" The worker asked in a cold voice. "To Molvotitsa." My dear man, you'll have to look for a hitchhiker, so you'll get there better." He told me that all summer and fall the Germans bombed Bologoy every day. At exactly 3 o'clock in the morning they would come and bomb. People are so used to it that an hour before the bombing they gather and go to the shelter, as if they were going to work. "Where do the civilians live?" I asked, looking at the ruins. "Peaceful, you say? We have no civilians now. There were, but the Germans made us unpeaceful. We are all at war. He told me how he had sent his son to the front, and his wife and 2 younger children could not find him after a night bombing. They were buried under the ruins of the house. Listening to him, I felt a fierceness boiling in my chest, already familiar to me from the time when I was at the front. I asked him the way to Molvatitsa, shook his rough hand. I poured half of the tobacco from my pouch and hurried to the crossroads of highways. On the way he pondered, and I was going on vacation. No, there's no time for vacations now. The earth is burning and groaning, we have to fight. I got to my unit. After the wound I was not fit for reconnaissance. I was appointed commander of a rifle company. The regiment headquarters was located at the old place, but I couldn't find Ryazantsev there. He was wounded in the same battle as me. Captain Titov, a judicious and calm man, was appointed chief of staff of the regiment. Kopylov was not in the regiment either. The new regiment commander, Major Kimadanov, turned out to be an acquaintance of mine. In the Kostroma hospital we were in the same ward with him. To this joy was added another one. In the dugout of the regiment reserve I met Senior Lieutenant Sasha Ponomarev, a school friend. With him we had been sitting at the same desk since the 1st grade. We studied together in the infantry school. After the school we were sent to different units, and suddenly we met. So many pleasant events in one day. Major Kimadanov sent us to the 1st Battalion to Captain Shipulin. I, the commander of a rifle company, and Ponomarev my deputy in the formation part. And again the front line. Again the trench. The only difference is that in spring and summer there was water in the trenches, and now there was snow. Snow fell often. It took a lot of effort to clean the trenches. And at the front line you need every second to be ready to repel a sudden attack of the enemy. Days and nights passed monotonously in labour and tension. The fascists were not very active, but when someone carelessly stuck out of the trench, they opened machine gun fire. Sometimes they fired artillery and mortars, hitting the squares. The snow around always remained black, dirty, though it fell every day. The time of severe frost came. The walls of the dugouts were covered with ice. From kettles and helmets soldiers made something like stoves. They made the dugout smoky and smoky. Eyes turned red and watery, but there was no real heat. Sasha Ponomarev once suggested to me, let's build a bathhouse in the Urals way with a steam room. I liked his idea. I wanted to have a steam bath. 100 meters from the first trench began to dig an excavation, and I and my deputies took part in the work. 10 days later the bathhouse was built. Of course we didn't have a real bathhouse. It was a deep excavation covered with logs in one roll, like a dugout, covered with frozen clods of earth on top. Inside there was a stove, a vat for hot water, and a shelf like a bunk for washing. On this site stood in defence for 3 months. Soldiers and commanders not only of our company, but of the whole battalion, who liked to steam, came to our bathhouse. But soon we parted with our bathhouse. On February 10th, our 166th Infantry Division, under the command of Major General Shakotsky, was withdrawn from Underbelly and redeployed to the area of Ramushevsky Isthmus. A few words about Ramushevsky Isthmus and Demyansk cauldron. Major battles of the Great Patriotic War, such as the battles of Moscow, Stalingrad and Kursk Bulge, are widely known to the Soviet people. They are included in textbooks. Not much has been written about the Demyansk cauldron, but nevertheless, for 17 whole months, that is almost a year and a half south of Lake Ilmen, in the forests and swamps there were exhausting bloody battles with the Nazis. By the fall of 1941, the Nazi troops occupied Stara Russa, Demyansk. In the future they planned to carry out a wider bilateral coverage of the Leningrad area by the 16th Army, towards which Finnish divisions were to advance from Petrozavodsk across the Yasvia River. In January 1942, the Soviet Supreme Command ordered the troops of the Northwestern Front to go on the offensive with the task the forces of the 11th Army under the command of Lieutenant General V. Morozov to attack the Leningrad region. Morozov to advance from the area of the station Parfino and Pola to the south to join the troops of the 34th Army. The troops of the 34th Army, commanded by Major General N.E. Bazarin, developed the offensive from Lake Salija in the Demyan direction. By the end of January, they reached the area Vatolino Morvatitsi, Novaya, and covered the Demyan grouping from the east and south. On February 20th, parts of the 1st Guards Rifle Corps of the 11th Army, advancing from the north to Ramushevo, joined the troops of the 34th Army in the village of Zalakyai. The Demyansk grouping of the Germans, consisting of 7 divisions of the 16th Army, was cut off from the old Russian grouping and surrounded. Thus the Demyansk cauldron was formed. After the encirclement of the enemy grouping in the Demyansk area, the northwestern front faced the task of liquidating it as quickly as possible. To avoid destruction of the 16th Army, the German fascist command concentrated a strong group of troops south of Staraya Russa, which on a narrow section of the front on March 20th, 1942 counterattacked our units in the direction of the village of Ramushevo. At the cost of huge losses, they managed to break through the defence and join the encircled group. Thus the Ramushevo corridor was formed. The Germans were able to reinforce the Demyan group with fresh forces along the corridor. Battles for Ramushevo were fought with small interruptions during the whole year. The Germans strengthened the Ramushevo corridor and attached great importance to its defence. On the 4th day of the march, our division reached the initial position for the offensive at Ramushevo. Our 1st Rifle Battalion, under the command of Captain N.V. Shipulin, received the task from the line northwest of the village Lykovichi to advance along the western bank of the river Lova and take possession of the village Visotovo. In the evening of February 14th, a significant event took place. We, Soviet soldiers, put on epaulettes. I took off the cubes from my buttonholes and put on my shoulders the epaulettes with 3 stars, and as if together with the epaulettes a new responsibility for the fate of my company, and specifically the responsibility for the capture of the village of Visotovo, lay on my shoulders. I earned together with it responsibility for the fate of the motherland. Morning of February 15th, 1943. The weather was clear. The frost reached 30 degrees. Windless. On the front line, silence, as if everything died out. Suddenly the silence was broken by a terrible force of artillery fire. Hundreds of Katyusha shells rained down on the enemy positions. At the first moment the air shuddered. It was as if an electric current ran through it. Then over the snowy white fields, black and dirty fountains soared. The next moment everything merged into something incomprehensible. Moaned, howled, shook. Our initial positions are at the edge of the forest. The village of Visotovo is a kilometre away. A whole kilometre of flat open ground. In 5 minutes I'm to lead the company into the attack. In the last seconds before the attack, my eyes ran from the edge of the forest across the flat, like a soccer field, neutral strip to the village of Visotovo. The company's right flank runs along the steep bank of the Lovov River. Artillery fire from our and German sides has reached its limit. Ice on the river from the bursts of shells, large and small pieces of large and small pieces together with mud columns rose up. I give the command. Air attack. Forward. For the motherland. For Stalin. Hurrah! The enemy defended stubbornly. Hitler was watching the fate of the Ramushevsky Isthmus and the half-enveloped 16th Army. Captain Nikolai Shipulin's battalion broke into the village. A short but brutal hand-to-hand fight ensued. There were no houses in Visotovo for a long time. They were mostly burned down, and the rest were scattered by the Germans for the construction of dugouts. There were half-destroyed board fences and willow wattles sticking out somewhere. I led the company from the left side of the fence. The battle was divided into many episodes. This is what happens in an attack. I, with a group of fighters, decided to turn through the breach to the right. In the breach I encountered a tall German dressed in a white, knee-length jacket, though it was no longer white but darkened with torn pockets. He was holding a machine gun. We stood one against the other for some time. He looked at me. I looked at him. I pulled the trigger. The German's automatic fell out. He grabbed his stomach with both hands. I ran to the precipice of the river, which behind the village makes a sharp turn and as if girdles Visotovo, and shouted, "Follow me." By mid-afternoon the battle had quieted down. The cratered streets of Vysotovo village were in our hands. To cross the Ramushevsky corridor and join the advancing troops of the 11th Army, we had no more than 2 kilometers to go. The enemy, having gathered the last forces, went into a counterattack. Again the battle broke out. Everything was covered with smoke, the ground rattled. There were 7 men left alive from the company. I lay down behind the machine gun, pressed the trigger. Maxim sent long lines into the ranks of the Germans. They were thinning, but the Nazis continued to run, on the move firing machine guns. Bullets clicked on the shield of the machine gun. I became afraid. The more afraid I was, the more I shot, and the more I shot, the more Germans fell in front of my machine gun. Finally, the Nazis lay down. Soon German tanks came to our positions. They were firing guns and machine guns. With my head in the ground, I was lying behind the machine gun, not firing. Suddenly I felt a blow on my right leg, above the knee, as if someone hit me with a stick. I even looked around, but I saw nothing but the smoke of explosions. I felt only that something warm flowed down my leg into my boot. Wounded. I moved my leg and groaned from the sharp pain. Everything hurt: arms, legs, back, head. I saw grey circles in front of my eyes. For some time I could not see anything. Regimental Commander Major Kimadanov introduced the second echelon into the battle. I got the moral right to leave the battle. For my machine gun lay San Instructor Gerasimov. I crawled with difficulty to the cliff of the river Lovov. On the field, through which we were advancing in the morning, to the edge of the forest were Nazi tanks. There was nothing left for me but to go down the cliff to the river and along the bank to the rear. In some places the water came under the cliff. I moved forward on the water, pushing away ice floes, dragging my broken leg. Now, 40 years later, I write these lines and I can hardly believe myself that it was possible to survive such a thing. I fell. I got up. And I walked again. To my right, up on the field, I heard the rumble of engines, cannon shots, the clanking of tracks and the gnashing of iron. Later, already in the hospital, I learned that our famous T-34 tanks went on the attack. There was a tank battle. The Germans couldn't stand it and began to retreat. And then I was walking, and at times it seemed to me that my strength was exhausted, and I would not take a step any more. I would fall into the water and die. In the evening, 100 meters away from me, on the edge of the cliff, I saw a dugout. There were people near it. I exerted my last strength, not walking, but crawling, climbing with my frostbitten fingers, trying to get up the slope, but sliding down again. I see a man in a white camouflage coat running towards me. I look closely. It turned out to be a nurse, a girl of 18 or 19 years old. I owe her my life. I wish I had asked her surname. I don't even know her name. She was a hard worker of the war. In the hospital, in the town of Vyshny Volochysk, I learned that the Ramushevsky Isthmus was liquidated. The Demyansk cauldron with the 16th German Army ceased to exist. Together with this pleasant news, I learned another. Sad news: my school friend, Deputy in Formation Unit, Senior Lieutenant Sasha Ponomarev, had his arm amputated. Battalion Commander Captain Nikolai Vasilievich Shipulin had both legs torn off. Regimental Commander Major Kimadanov was killed. From my company there were 5 men left in the ranks. Until 1944, Vyshny Volochysk was a frontline town. During the winter offensive of 1943, the Germans subjected it to frequent bombing. We, wounded, were taken from the hospital to shelters. The Nazis bombed, as a rule, at night. In the middle of the night, the doctor on duty raised the alarm. Walkers to shelter, stretchers for the bedridden. It was easier for those who could walk. They quickly got dressed and went down to the shelter. We, on the other hand, had to suffer a lot of agony while the stretcher was handed over and the orderlies carried us to the place. Somewhere nearby, bombs were exploding, searchlight beams crossed the sky, the walls of the hospital were shaking, the glass of the windows broken by the blast wave was ringing. And you lie helpless on a bunk and wait for your turn. Once I was carried by 2 elderly orderlies, and on the stairs of the 2nd floor they overturned the stretcher. I fell face down. Someone in the dark stepped on my wounded leg. But compared to what people experienced at the front, all these were trifles. At the end of April, a captain came to the hospital. He said that he was the head of the personnel department of the frontline officer courses. Immediately began to find out who of the convalescing company commanders want to enroll in a 3-month course for commanders of rifle battalions. I gave my consent. I studied, however, not long 2 weeks. Wake up, exercise, classes on statutes and manuals. Everything like in peacetime. And I didn't like it. People are fighting, giving their lives in battle, and I'm learning. And I should learn something good, but not the statutes, which I already know. That's how I reasoned in my youth at that time. I wrote a report on expulsion to the head of the course, a colonel, who before the war was the military commandant of a large city. I was very much afraid that I would be rejected. The colonel was said to be a strict, even harsh officer, and even with peculiar quirks. They told of such a case. The colonel's daughter in the rank of sergeant served in the headquarters of the course, and once 5 minutes late for work. She was summoned by the head of the course and demanded to explain her lateness. The daughter replied something like this: "After our breakfast with you, Daddy, I was cleaning up the dishes." The colonel got up from the table, approached his daughter, and said, "Comrade Sergeant, I am not a stick, but the head of the front courses, do not forget yourself." For lateness to work and for Daddy 10 days of arrest. After submitting the report, I had no desire to study. And then there was talk among the listeners that many troops were being withdrawn from the Northwestern Front and sent to the south. They mentioned our 166th Infantry Division. The south was a dream of the officers. Everyone wanted to go there. And not because it was warm there. It was something else. After all, the historic Battle of Stalingrad had just ended. Our troops were advancing in the entire southern direction and had success. And here are the courses, and even the Northwestern Front. I was anxiously waiting for a call to the colonel. But to my surprise, everything turned out to be much simpler. The course attendant, also a student, like me, said, "Neustrov from the headquarters transferred that you immediately go to the personnel department for a referral to the unit. Don't forget to bring your duffel bag." The direction stated that I was obliged to report to the 166th Rifle Division. I was glad again I was going to my division, in which I had fought for a year and a half. Soon I arrived at the place. I searched almost the whole Romushevsky district, but I didn't find my division there. I made inquiries. Some said that perhaps it had been transferred to another section of the front. Others said that the division had been withdrawn from the front line. But where? Nobody could explain. After a week of searching, I decided to go again to the personnel department of the Northwestern Front. On the way I had some disappointing thoughts. I had abandoned my studies, I had not found my division, and I was wandering around like a homeless man. In the personnel department of the front I was told that there was no need to look for the 166th Division. It was no longer on the Northwestern Front. I was sent to the 151st Separate Rifle Brigade, commanded by Colonel Yakovlev. The brigade was in defence near Staraya Russa. The headquarters was in the village of Vizvady on the shore of Lake Ilmen. Colonel Yakovlev appointed me commander of the 1st Rifle Company in Major Pinchuk's battalion. The 1st Rifle Company of the headquarters of the battalion was located in the village of Otvid. This settlement was only on the map. On the place where once there was a village, there were only stovepipes. Combat Major Pinchuk introduced me to the situation. He informed me that the company, which I was to command, was 3 kilometers away, and as soon as it got dark, I would go there by boat. It was impossible to get there during the day. The area is flooded with water, and the space between the 1st Company and the battalion headquarters is shot by the enemy. It's still a long way to the evening. "For now, rest," he said in conclusion. In the rear of the battalion I found the kitchen. At the boiler stood a long and skinny soldier. At first I thought it was a kitchen worker, but it turned out to be the cook. I smiled. A cook, and so skinny. We got to talking. He was in his 40s. Before the war, Ilya Yakovlevich Sanov worked in Zauziria, Kostanay region, as chief accountant of a state farm. He was sociable, and it was pleasant to talk to him. I did not know then that fate would bind us firmly and we would have to go a long way together. "Comrade Senior Lieutenant," Lunch is ready. Have some meat soup with dumplings, offered Sarnov. Frankly speaking, I didn't like the lunch. I was hungry, but I didn't eat much. In the pot was not soup, but some sticky muddy mass. Sarnov looked at me point blank. You don't like it? No, I answered honestly. And then he explained to me. I became a cook after I was wounded. I was in the hospital for 4 months. I was left skin and bones. The battalion decided he's no good as a gunner. Let him be a cook. He'll get better. Maybe he'll make a cook. An old man with experience. It's no big deal to cook porridge. Anyone can do it. Yes, as it seems, I won't make a cook out of me. I can't wait to be sent to the company. They'll send you to the front line. Don't be in a hurry. You'll definitely get there, I assured them. In the evening, I sailed to the new place of service in the village of Babki, where my company was stationed. Tulabel Bay of Lake Ilmen overflowed for dozens of kilometers, everything around flooded. On the way, the liaison told me. Babki are standing on the swamp, and in front of them, at the top, a village. The Germans are there. The evening came. It was quiet. The boat was going fast. In the distance, rockets flashed frequently in the sky, illuminating the calm surface of the water, which seemed orange, then light, then black. Then came a choking line. The machine guns started up. They strobed like sewing machines. Tracer bullets streaked the sky. I was enjoying the clean spring air, but already I felt my worries engulfing me. I remembered the words of the commander. I'm entrusting you with the most responsible section. I trust you. It caused pride and concern. Bullets whistled in the air. I became wary, looked into the semi-darkness. Flashes ahead. Bullets hit the water, ricocheted and drifted away, leaving behind a long, thin, ringing sound. The rowers were talking merrily among themselves. The atmosphere was familiar to them. I couldn't wait to tell them. Row faster, but I kept silent. I only thought how quickly you get used to the whistle of bullets. But you get used to it just as quickly. Something black appeared ahead. I looked closely the tops of bushes. Here we have arrived, Comrade Senior Lieutenant, loudly reported the liaison officer. Quiet, I said involuntarily. Immediately I repented. I'm starting my service in a new place. What will people think of me? The liaison said. It's far away from the German, about 800 meters. He won't hear you. Babki. Why this area was called Babki, it is difficult to say. Soldiers assumed different things. Some said that there were beautiful meadows and children probably came here to play dough. Others said that before the war there had been 4 courtyards here, where the women lived and there were no men. So they called it Babki. Not that. Senior Sergeant Kucherin intervenes in the conversation. Only old women lived here, and they called it Babki in honor of old women. You, of course, know better, agrees an elderly and wrinkled fighter Artemiev, the second number of the hand machine gun, clapping Kucherin on the red thick neck. You guys, don't argue with the senior sergeant. He knows where Babas can live and where Babkas can live. Laughter rolled through the bushes. It was agreed old women lived here. Grannies were flooded, the water was up to their waists. There were different arguments about that too. The dam had burst on the bay shore, so the water rushed in, Kucherin claimed. Not a dam at all, argued Artemiev, but such a good spring. All winter the Germans had been defending these lowlands. Spring decided to flood them. Fritz rushed to Medvedno, and this area became empty. Our superiors ordered us to occupy it. It's a swamp, but it's ours, that's all. That's how it was. Satisfied with his reasoning, Artemiev finished. Yes, it is ours. We held a circular defence in Babki. The water was above the waist, and every day it was arriving. At night from the big land we brought log rafts, 5 men each. They were placed in the bushes. The bushes served as camouflage. During the day people could only lie on the rafts. It was impossible to rise up. They would be cut down by a machine gun or sniper. The Germans did not spare ammunition. That's how our floating garrison lived. At night we were delivered by boats ammunition, dry rations and occasionally hot food. However, it was only called hot people got cold soup. As a joke we called the soup not hot, but liquid food. Soon Sarnov came to Babki. I was glad to see him. Ilya Yakovlevich, did you bring liquid food? No, I've come to replenish it. I appointed Syakov as a second number of a hand machine gun on the flank raft instead of the killed Artemiev. In June, the water receded. We didn't notice it at once. We got used to the water. We thought it was the right thing to do. The bushes spread thick green foliage. The ground was covered with grass. Wooden rafts became unnecessary. Firing points were equipped on the ground, but it was impossible to dig rifle and machine gun cells. Dig the ground for one bayonet, water comes out. Checking the defense of the company, I stayed for a long time at the calculation of the machine gun. Junior Sergeant Tit Porfiryevich Anikin, the commander of the calculation, proudly told me how he and his calculation had prepared sod at night on the neutral zone and made a good barnyard out of it, similar to a barricade. His initiative was valuable. In a few days of sod built a human-sized earthen rampart 2 meters thick. Comrade company commander, and we got a real fortress. Surrounded by a powerful rampart, the soldiers rejoiced. Now we can finally walk behind the rampart even in full height. At the end of June, the Germans conducted a night reconnaissance with the strength up to a rifle platoon with the task to take our tongue. German reconnaissance was a serious test of vigilance and combat effectiveness of the company. Life in the defense has its own laws. Firmly established by the combat situation during the day, 1/3 of the personnel is on the firing points behind machine guns and guns, the rest. At night, on the contrary, 2/3 of the personnel and the entire officer staff on combat duty. The night of June 28th was dark and quiet. On the trees and bushes did not move a single leaf. The Germans, as usual, were firing from machine guns and automatic rifles with tracer bullets and illuminated the area with rockets. I went around the entire defense, talked to the fighters and lingered on the right flank at the machine gun. At that time, a contact from the commander of the platoon of anti-tank guns, Senior Lieutenant Artem Grigorievich Kazakov, came running after me and told me that there was something wrong in front of the defense of their platoon. I hurried over to Kazakov. He was lying behind a hand-held machine gun. The fallen shift of 17 fighters, led by Sergeant Ishimnikov, was raised on alarm and made up my reserve. The platoon commander spoke in a whisper. "Comrade Comrade, do you hear?" I strained my hearing. Ahead, quite close, maybe 50 meters, I caught a rustle. Someone is crawling towards us. At the same time, I pay attention to the line of fascist defense. Usually the Germans were machine gunning, firing low, above the ground. They were firing at our firing points, and there were small pauses between the bursts. But now the machine guns were firing non-stop, and the strange thing was that the tracer bullets were piercing the sky high above. Yes, indeed, something was amiss. I sent 2 liaisons with the order open fire only on my command. Prepared for battle. My mind was full of thoughts. What do the Germans intend to do? How many of them? What kind of battle? It was necessary to make a decision immediately what and how to do. And what decision can you make when you have a lot of unknowns in front of you? It's not so easy to make a decision with many unknowns. If you make a mistake, dozens of people will die. The rustling is getting closer. I hear breathing. Fire. I give the command in a loud voice. Our machine guns and automatic rifles started talking. Immediately I send liaisons to platoon commanders with the order conduct continuous fire from the place, only from the place, and on the signal green rocket, shout hurrah with all your might on the spot. I heard the Germans shouting. Fire intensified. The barrels of machine guns became hot. Every fraction of a second we waited for the enemy to rush to the attack. But there was no attack. I commanded fire with grenades. Machine guns, grenades, a sea of red-hot metal flew into the enemy. I give a green rocket. Hurrah drowned out the sounds of firing. Slowly dawn is coming. The Germans are not visible. I give the order ceasefire. There was silence. In front, in the bushes, someone moaned. I ordered Senior Lieutenant Kazakov to move forward with a reserve group and examine the terrain. Not 2 or 3 minutes later, a pistol shot rang out in the bushes, and at once I heard Kazakov's loud voice. "Ah, you bastard, you're still shooting." Kazakov had captured the wounded German lieutenant who had shot at him. The combing of the terrain turned out to be encouraging. 26 German corpses were found in front of our ramparts, and the reconnaissance commander was taken prisoner. At the interrogation at the battalion headquarters, the German lieutenant testified that he had the task with his platoon of 30 men to make a reconnaissance of the defence and take the tongue. However, at night he lost his orientation and could not determine exactly where the front line was, and thus put his group under our machine guns. He did not, and could not say that did his job and the vigilance of our fighters and commanders. And of course the skill of Soviet soldiers to fight learned, this is not the 41st. According to the commander of the Nazi reconnaissance, it turned out that only 3 of his soldiers escaped. By order of Major Pinchuk, we collected German corpses and buried them. After the battle, there was a special feeling of mutual respect between me, the company commander, and the personnel. I was proud that we had no losses, there were not even wounded among us. This is a great joy. By August 18th, 151st Independent Rifle Brigade regrouped its forces. The second echelons of the brigade went to the front line and took initial positions for the offensive. Our 1st Rifle Company was reinforced with artillery, mortars, and shifted 2 kilometers to the left, on the bank of the River Polist, to the mark of 19.0. From this point the company was to attack with the task to seize the Brus Grove, and further to go around the village of Medvedno. The August offensive of the North-Western Front troops was connected with the Soviet Army offensive after the Battle of Kursk on the central section of the front. It was necessary to bind the forces of the fascist troops in the northwest so that they could not remove even a part of their troops from here and transfer them to the central front. For 3 days there were silent battles in the swamps in front of the town of Staraya Russa. The village Medvedno twice passed from hand to hand. Our company on August 18th, 1943, with small losses knocked out Germans from Brus Grove, but could not advance further. On the second day the enemy made a counterattack, but suffered heavy losses, retreated, leaving 3 burned tanks and dozens of corpses on the battlefield. On the order of Major Pinchuk, the company entrenched in the grove and went to the defence. On August 21st, our offensive was suspended. By that time Major Pinchuk's battalion had been fighting on the front line for more than 6 months and badly needed a rest. By decision of the brigade commander, we were moved to the second echelon. The village of Chertitsko, our new place of deployment, was once famous for fishing. The houses there were good, people lived in prosperity. Fishermen are strong, determined people. Now there are a few houses and a church left from Chertitsko. There were no inhabitants. The battalion commander conducted a reconnaissance with us, company commanders. The companies spread out on the outskirts of the village and began to dig trenches, build bunkers and dugouts. Here I became friends with the commander of the 2nd Company, Captain Mikhail Ivanovich Anikin. Before the war, he worked as a teacher at school, taught history. In his spare time, Anikin could talk for hours about the school, about the children he taught. From the school, Mikhail Ivanovich transferred the conversation to the soldiers and sergeants of his company. And here you could feel his care for people and respect for them. The captain did not speak ill of any man. He was not only a commander, but also the father of the company. Captain Anikin enjoyed such authority among his subordinates and senior commanders that it could be envied. We young 20-year-old officers became attached to the commander of the 2nd Company and tried to be like him. Mikhail Ivanovich celebrated his 40th birthday in Chertitsky. His birthday was organized by his petty officer Diniga, also Mikhail Ivanovich. They were called so in the battalion Mikhail Ivanovich Sr. and Mikhail Ivanovich Jr. The petty officer was about 25 years old. Soldiers' labor and sweat created the defense quickly. Already in 5 days, combatant Pinchuk and his deputy on the political part of Major Subaltern inspected the company sites. The best positions were in the second company. We were told. Learn from Anikin. I, with platoon commanders and company petty officer Grigory Ivanovich Olifer, bypassed the defence site Anikin, carefully examined each firing point, trench and the course of messages. The commander was right, everything here is built with knowledge. My petty officer for 3 days not far from Chertitsky prepared building materials. He prepared kindling, poles, logs. There was an oak grove 3 kilometres from the village. In May 1942, German artillery firing positions were located there. The grove was damaged, century-old oaks with uprooted roots were lying piled one on top of another. Petty Officer Olfer decided to use them to complete the defence. Logs, poles and brushwood were delivered to the positions, and work began again. Trenches and passages were reinforced with brushwood. The bunkers were covered with oak logs. The remaining ones were used to build the commander's dugout. The walls were made of logs, the floor was laid of poles. There were carpenters, joiners and stove makers in the company. In the middle of the dugout a table, benches. Along the walls there were wooden bunks. How pleasant, even soft it was to sleep on such bunks. In the Babka garrison the bunks were earthen, damp, and they made my sides ache. But here everything is made of wood. The mattresses were stuffed with fresh, fragrant hay. You enter such a dugout, and the pleasure even takes your breath away. Grigory Ivanovich was good. The construction of the earth rampart in Babki was under his direct leadership, however. The plan was mine, and the preparation and laying of sod. He commanded the yeoman was a man of initiative. He would organize a company shoemaker's shop. He would catch fish and feed the whole company with soup. Then in the evening he would go into the soldiers' trench and arrange a choral singing of Ukrainian songs. And he could sing. I asked Anikin not to build a new dugout, but to live in mine with all the officers of the company and the petty officer. He agreed. We lived amicably. We spent many interesting evenings, learned a lot from Anikin from the history of the land of Prilman. In the second echelon stood for 2 months. This time remained in memory for the whole life. Here there was a persistent, and at the same time interesting study of the personnel of the companies. Here I understood the taste, even acquired a craving for learning. Anikin instilled in me the skills of methodical training. In November, the 151st Separate Rifle Brigade was reorganized into the 756th Rifle Regiment. The neighboring 127th Cadet Brigade was reorganized into the 674th and the 144th into the 469th Regiment. Thus, the 3 brigades formed the 150th Rifle Division, which later stormed. From near Stara Russa, the newly formed division was transferred to the area of Veliki Luki. It was a pity to leave the defence of the second echelon, created by great soldiers' work, and the commanders jokingly said we should take such good trenches and dugouts with us. We left the village of Chertitsko at the end of November 1943. At the station Pola, the 150th Infantry Division was loaded into freight cars and taken to the east. Then they turned to the south, soon to the west. We rode and wondered where they were taking us. We assumed all sorts of things, but nobody knew anything. We passed the station of Toropets. Ahead lay the town of Veliki Luki, which had already been taken by the troops of the 3rd Shock Army. Before reaching the city, we unloaded from the train at a small station. At night, regimental columns together with the convoys passed through Veliki Luki on foot. The city was badly destroyed, especially in the area of the railroad station. Instead of houses, there were only walls. There was not a single light in the city, not a single human soul. We walked as if through a cemetery. In the morning, the column stopped on the western outskirts of the city. Only here I noticed dugouts from which people were coming out. The sight of them caused a heavy-feeling half-undressed old men, old women and children, emaciated from hunger and the troubles suffered during the occupation. Their faces were pale and wrinkled. I saw old women who were only 15 years old, grey, yellow, as if made of wax. From the west came the rumble of artillery cannonade. Somewhere ahead there was fighting. Even near Stara Russa, when a division was created from 3 brigades, there was a reshuffling of the command staff. The division was commanded by our brigade commander Colonel Yakovlev, the chief of the political department was appointed a man also from our brigade, Colonel Nikolai Efimovich Voronin. Major Pinchok Alexei Ivanovich left us to command the 674th Rifle Regiment, and in the 756th Regiment from the Army headquarters sent Lieutenant Colonel Zhidkov. Our 1st Battalion was also commanded by new officers. Major Aristov Evstafi Mikhailovich became the commander, Major Sabatin became the deputy on political part, Senior Lieutenant Georgy Rozhkov became the chief of staff. A few words about Rozhkov. He was 22 years old. He was slender, tall, and in character cheerful and businesslike. He could play the accordion, which he never parted with, played the guitar and balalaika. I never thought that you can play so well on such a simple instrument as the balalaika. I thought that it was only used for playing the balalaika, but our Zora, as we began to call him, played all kinds of melodies, fast dancing, quiet sad, and then some other long sing-songy ones. He would come, sometimes, at a long halt in the company, first checking whether all the entrenchments were in place in case of a sudden enemy air raid, look at the soldiers and commanders, shame someone for sloppiness, praise someone, and then sit in the soldiers' circle and say, "Run someone to the staff wagon, bring an accordion." How much energy he had! He had time everywhere, never looked tired, always taut, neat and cheerful. This officer brought joy and that mental uplift which is so necessary in the harsh front life. The Northwestern Front was soon disbanded and on its basis created 3 Baltic fronts. The 2nd Baltic, which included our 3rd Shock Army, was commanded by Army General Andrei Ivanovich Eremenko. From December 1943 until the end of March 1944, that is, for 4 months, the division was involved in continuous fighting. 4 months. During this time we took dozens of villages and hundreds of unnamed heights and left them under the onslaught of superior enemy forces, and then again went on the attack. General Vasily Mitrofanovich Shatilov in his book The Banner over the Reichstag, written after the war, said last December, the situation on the section of the front occupied by the 3rd Shock Army was extremely difficult. The army found itself in a semicircle, popularly known as the Nevelsky Sack. However, the Nazi troops acting against it were themselves under the threat of encirclement. The enemy was particularly active on the flanks, but trying to tie the bag. Blows of his infantry and tanks followed one after another. Hitlerites had more communications, and consequently, and better opportunities to supply ammunition, food and replenishment of people. In leaflets dropped from German airplanes in the location of our units, with clumsy wit wrote, "We are in the ring." And you are in the ring. Let's see what happens at the end. At the end, the enemy ring managed to break. Especially hard fighting had to be conducted for the settlements of Shilika, Poplavy, and the height of 167.4. The division was ordered to seize the height by all means, and it undertook one frontal attack after another. The height was taken, but at what cost? Here I'd like to make a small digression. It is commonly thought that it is difficult to take only cities that are significant in their strategic and economic position. In fact, it is not so. There are nameless heights, which have only tactical importance on the scale of a regiment, division or army. But they must be taken, and they are taken with great difficulty, and here nothing can be stopped, because it ensures the success of a number of compounds. The soldiers of our division did not yet know that they were to storm Berlin and the Reichstag itself, but they took this height with the faceless mark 167.4 with complete soldierly self-denial. It came at a high price. This is both military discipline and a feat. There were only 2,200 people left in the 150th Division. At the end of April, we were transferred to the 2nd echelon of the army. The way lay along the Nevelsk Highway, covered with puddles. People wandered half-shod, some in felt boots. Others wrapped their legs with duffel bags and grenade bags. In the air hovered the enemy aviation. The column was subjected to continuous bombing day and night. On the 5th or 6th day of the journey from the city of Veliki Luki battalion of Major Aristov, before dawn approached the village of Kamenka. Ahead, maybe not further than 2 or 3 kilometers, past the front line. We could hear the choking sounds of machine gun bursts. Behind the village, in a dense coniferous forest, Porotno stopped for a 24-hour halt. In the afternoon, the commander gathered us, company commanders, and took us to the front line. We had to change some part. The company commander, whom I was changing, met me unfriendly. I looked him over. He looked to be about 30 years old, dressed in a camouflage robe, soiled with trench clay, overgrown with beard, with a prickly and angry look. Yes, he had obviously had a hard time, I thought. As if guessing my thought, he said, "Why are you looking at me like that? If you're in my shoes, you'll become like that yourself." But later he did talk, and I learned some details. My master used to command platoons of company 50mm mortars. His rank was petty officer. The company commander was killed a week ago. The platoon commanders were long gone too. There were 9 men left in the company together with the petty officer. We attacked as a battalion on the height 167.4 for 8 days and could not take it. I asked the master to show me the company site. On the front it had 300 meters, equipped with full-profile trenches, but they were empty, no one to stand in the cells. "Here it is, the damned height." "Look, Captain, study tomorrow, obviously you will attack," said the petty officer with exasperation. I decided to soften him by making a suggestion. "The enemy's losses are obviously not less. On the night of December 20th we occupied the trenches in front of the height. On the 21st were scheduled to attack. The whole day was spent in hard work. In the morning called the commander, him gathered all the company commanders, aim artillery and tank commanders, considered the height, as they say on the ground, then agreed on issues of interaction. Clarified, linked everything down to the smallest detail. Major Aristov gave the order. My 1st Rifle Company, with a company of T-34 tanks, with a battery of 76mm guns supported by a battery of divisional artillery, was to attack on the right flank of the battalion from the western slopes of the unnamed height. To the left went the 2nd Company of Captain Anikin. The morning of December 21st, 1943. Quiet. Along the entire line of the initial positions of the regiment soared green rockets, the signal of artillery preparation. The heights were covered with the smoke of explosions and fountains of earth. It was as if the enemy had expected it. After the first shots, the fascists returned fire on our positions. Everything mixed up. Rumble. Thunder. Clang and squeal. After 30 minutes of fierce fire, red rockets, the signal of attack. I jump out of the trench. For a moment in full height, even raised on my toes, raising up my right hand with a gun, tightly clutching the handle, make a half-turn to the left and give the command, to the limit of straining my voice. Company. For the motherland. Follow me forward. 100 men as one in an instant rushed to the heights. Many overtake me, someone fell. Communists. I hear the voice of Lieutenant Trofimov, Deputy for Political Affairs, after me. Komsomol soldiers. Forward. Shouted Sergeant Fetisov, Company Commissar. And here are the slopes of the height. We're climbing up. The slopes are steep. Breath from the fast running took over. Stabbing in the lungs, from under the cap sweat runs down the face in streams. Well, dear, I mentally turned to the soldiers of the company. There is not much left. Here are the trenches of the enemy, up to them some 30 to 40 meters. Well. At that time, dozens of 2 fascists up to the waist rose above the barrier, and grenades flew thickly at us. The company rolled to the foot of the height. That day we went up to the attack 3 more times, and 3 times we rolled back. Evening came. The firing was getting weaker on both sides. At dusk the height 167.4 looked dark, almost black. In the ravine, 100 to 150 meters in front of the German defense line, 2 or 3 soldiers were lying in the craters. Yes, the height, indeed, turned out to be cursed. The fascists occasionally lit up the area with rockets, fired bursting and tracer bullets. Crawling from funnel to funnel, I make my way along the line of platoons. I want to find out the losses, talk to my men, give them a task. I came back with a heavy thought. The losses were great. I found comfort only in one thing: the mood of the men was fighting. My NP was located in a large funnel from a high explosive shell. The crater was so deep that there was water at the bottom of it. Battalion communicators restored telephone communication. The telephone set buzzed. I picked up the phone. I hear the commander's voice. Neustroyev, leave someone for yourself, and yourself immediately to me. My liaison, or as they called it at the front, Resident Grisha Osintsev was killed, and I took the first soldier with me. He turned out to be an 18-year-old boy, Vasya Sukhanov. We crawled or ran across to the battalion observation post. Major Aristov's first question was very simple. How many men? 34, Comrade Major, I answered. Evstafi Mikhailovich was silent for a minute, then looked somewhere in the ceiling of his dugout. As if in thought, he said, the regimental commander ordered to make 1 company out of 3 rifle companies. Captain Mikhail Ivanovich Anikin was killed. It became quiet in the dugout, so quiet that one could hear the telephone wire burning, which illuminated the dugout. A direct hit squeezed out the commander. From Anikin, Petty Officer Dinega found only 1 tablet. Yes, the losses were significant. Jora Rozhkov was also killed. I came out of the dugout. I was terribly thirsty. I wanted to douse the fire with cold water, vodka, anything. There was no water, vodka even less. I decided to swallow snow. But there was no snow around the dugout either. The snow had been blown away by blast waves into the ravine. I went down there. Instead of snow, I saw drifts of soot, mixed with fragments of mines and shells. I returned to the dugout. I hear. Neustroyev, pass the people to the commander of the 3rd Company, Captain Korolev, and you take the Chief of Staff, because I was left alone. Major handed me battle topographic maps with the situation on them. The headquarters dugout was next to the commander. It was an excavation no more than 2 meters long and 1.5 meters wide, covered from above with logs in 1 roll. On the right, narrow earthen bunks. I asked Vasya Sukhanov to stoke the stove attached at the end of the bunks. I put the battle maps in an iron box from under the tapes of a machine gun and, drenched with mortal fatigue, went to bed. I woke up from the heat. The cast iron stove was red hot. Well done, I thought of the new resident. I shuffled my hands on my boots. The Kurzovi shins were hot. No, this will not do. I said to myself, the bunks are short, heels reach the stove. For goodness sake, Sleepy can scorch his own feet. I take the box, which served as a pillow, and place it by the stove. Now you can sleep, it won't burn through such a barrier. I slept no more than 2 hours. I jump up, there was smoke in the dugout. I felt my boots, everything is all right. My overcoat was also intact. I took the box, and immediately dropped it. It was red hot, and smoke was pouring out of it. I opened the door, kicked his staff chancellery out of the dugout. I went to the commander. He was awake. He was glad to see me. Well, Comrade Chief of Staff, can't sleep either? Comrade Major, my combat maps were burned in the box. Wait, talk to them. Aristov raised his voice. When I told about what had happened, he was silent for a long time, then came up to me, looked at me point blank, and hissed angrily. Go to hell, Comrade Chief of Staff. March to the company. I'm out of the dugout, my fault. But before I could close the door behind me, I heard him. Come back. Okay, Stepan, don't be angry with me, old man. I don't know what LT. Kol. Zhidkov will tell me, but you'd better be in company. This he said conciliatory, even calmly. He reminded me that at 8000 artillery preparation, at 9000 the attack. They synchronized their watches, hugged and kissed. Evstafi Mikhailovich accompanied me to the trench. After the battles, the regiment and the division headquarters learned about how I was on the post of Chief of Staff for one night. They joked about it. And I answered, not everyone can be a staff officer. And I am a company commander. I did not know then that soon I would become a commander. Captain Korolev Nikolai Zinovyevich became Chief of Staff. I was the commander of the United Company. And the battle continued. All night there was an intensified firefight. The enemy was calmer last night. Today he was firing from all kinds of weapons, continuously illuminated the area with rockets. His planes twice bombed our fighting order. We assumed the Nazis are obviously preparing a major reconnaissance, or in the morning will go on the offensive. Every now and then the telephone rang. Combat demanded to intensify observation of the enemy's behavior and prepare to repel his attacks. The night stretched languidly long, nerves were strained to the limit. Before dawn, enemy rockets began to rise less often in the air, weakened and machine gun fire. The Krot is tired, exhausted. Olfer nodded his head in the direction of the heights, raised the collar of his coat, put his head on the empty thermos, and closed his eyes. I look at him carefully. His cheeks are sunken in, his chin is sharpened, stubble has grown, his beard is like a steel brush. Yes, there's nothing to say. This altitude wore us out. In a word, cursed. No one in the company that night did not sleep a wink. Now, when the firing stopped, I wanted to sleep badly. My head felt heavy, as if leaden, and it just kept drooping down. I wanted to lie down next to the petty officer and rest at least an hour, but the phone rang again. I picked up the phone and heard the angry voice of Major Aristov. We missed it. What were you looking at? I warned you. The enemy is gone. And he did leave. He tricked us. The whole regiment stirred up, orders and instructions came. The meaning of them boiled down to one thing: catch up with the enemy. Don't let him get a foothold. The company, in a line of platoon columns, passed over the heights, went out on its back slopes. We passed through some more heights, and an even white field opened before us. It was so white that it hurt my tired eyes. To the right and left moved troops. How many of them? The cannons were being pulled on horseback, riding horses, waving whips, shouting excitedly. But, come on, let's go. The snow is above the waist. Artillerymen, grasping the wheels, help the riders and also shout. Let's go. Battalion and regimental wagons showed up. When we were advancing on the height, I thought that only my company was attacking the cursed and the fascists were pouring all their fire on it, only on it alone. Maybe there are no other units already. In fact, the whole 756th Rifle Regiment lived and fought. And now it is going west, though slowly, but west. These thoughts brought relief, and it was not so hard at heart. The enemy had withdrawn about 6 kilometers and met us with dense mortar fire from the unnamed heights, where his second line of defense was located. In front of the heights stretched a deep ravine. The company reached the ravine, and I gave the order dig in. In some places the ravine was covered with snow, in some places we could see steep banks. I put out machine gunners and machine gunners on duty. They quickly and skillfully, as if they had been digging the ground all their lives, equipped along the edge of the ravine with rifle cells and machine gun platforms. From here the terrain could be seen far ahead. The wire fence of the enemy, his bunkers, were clearly visible. Free from combat duty, the company personnel dug into the snow and got a chance to sleep a little. Soon battalion communicators installed a telephone set. I report to the commander that the company is entrenched, observers are exposed, and the rest are resting. Here we stood until January 1st, 1944. A small respite after a week of hard fighting was badly needed. We were replenished. The battalion again had 3 rifle companies. On New Year's Eve, the division commander, Colonel Yakovlev, conducted a reconnaissance with the commanders of rifle regiments and battalions, commanders of attached and supporting units. We company commanders were summoned to it. Here I first saw the famous combatants of the 150th Division, Majors Sergei Chernobrovkin and Ivan Koltunov, Captains Vasily Davidov and Fyodor Ionkin. The division headquarters developed a detailed plan of the offensive, taking into account the mistakes and miscalculations made in the battles for the height 167.4. And now came the morning of January 1st, 1944. The earth trembled. Within an hour, the artillery preparation lasted. Bombers under cover of fighters in batches went to the rear of enemy defences. and then together with tanks went into the attack, and the first trench of the enemy was covered with dead. The artillerymen did a good job. We passed another 500 meters. The second trench appeared. The enemy is making an attempt to stop the advancing, but without success. Our famous T-34s are irradiating the enemy positions. Assault aviation on a bursting flight handles the rear of the Germans. During the day of the offensive, we moved forward about 20 kilometers. Combat ordered. The battalions chain to roll up, reorganize into a line of columns and accelerate the movement. I'm going to the head of the column. Tension has fallen, everyone's mood is cheerful, and in the ranks are already going soldier talk. I hear the cheerful voice of Junior Sergeant Solodovnikov. It is a good omen that in the new year we come successfully, so the whole year will be lucky. That's right, Comrade Sergeant, supports the tall fighter from the last replenishment. New Year's omens come true. I had a case the 39th met. Well, properly, a week in advance began to prepare, bought all sorts of things. My wife, Daria, grilled, steamed. We were waiting for the guests, and then my brother-in-law came running and asked help me, Vasya, to move the barrel with sauerkraut from the closet to the shed, because it's getting in the closet. I said to Daria, I'll run away for a minute, so I went. The Shoryak's wife was in town studying at a course. She didn't come to the holiday, so he was alone. I rolled out the barrel. I should have gone home right away. But he wouldn't let me go. He dragged me into the house. We went in and had a drink, then another. At night, he and I found ourselves at Petruka's neighbour's house. That's where we celebrated the new year. The ranks laughed. The soldier continued. I came home in the morning. And there it was. Daria, as if dumbfounded, jumped on me with a ladle and started to woo me. I thought she'd give up for a day or two. But no, she was mad for a whole year. An omen. I don't know about you guys, but I believe in omens. When I remember the 39th, my ribs ache to this day. That's what another soldier picks up. I have this. I listened to my soldiers and thought what a great strength you have in the people. No hardships, no difficulties can break it. A man has slightly moved away from the battle, and already there are cheers and laughter. Somewhere far ahead, maybe 10 kilometers away, the cannons rumbled. It was not hard to guess it was our tank units, which overtook the infantry, that started the battle. Senior Lieutenant Saluka, the new Chief of Staff, rode up on horseback and transmitted the commander's order. The tanks have reached the village of Shilika and are fighting. Without breaks, accelerated march, go to the northeastern outskirts of the village and attack from the start. I unfolded the map, began to assess the situation. The company on the off-road in deep snow has already passed more than 20 kilometers. There are still 7 kilometers to Shilika. Now 17 hours and 10 minutes. We will reach the planned boundary not earlier than in 2 hours. Even now people are feeling extremely tired. And what will happen in 2 hours? Attack from the start. Well, nothing, we'll live and see. In the meantime, we have to march towards the battle without delay, and I'm in the habit of commanding. Tighten up. Wider step. I try to go wider myself, but my step is getting narrower and narrower. We still reached this village and, having turned around, rushed at the enemy. The attack, however, was unsuccessful. Fighting for Shilika took quite a long and heavy character. The village changed hands a dozen times in 5 days. In January and February days, and not only days but also nights, there were continuous battles. The terrain was hilly, riddled with ravines, and constrained the actions of our troops, especially tank units. The Nazi defence had a great depth. Every height and hill they surrounded with wire fence and turned into strongholds. But as a result of hard fighting, we took this village. After the battles for Shilika, the division was transferred to the second echelon. However, we didn't have to rest for a long time. We received new replenishment and again went into battle. One after another, we took nameless heights. How many of them were conquered, and how many of our men were left there. But the heights had to be taken. Without it, we would not have reached Berlin.